The idea that struck me the most was the idea of creation. And so there were two quotes here that stood out to me. So the first one, and they're both on page 62 of our textbook. It says, whether God made the earth in 6 days or by means of an evolutionary process that took millions and millions of years is of secondary importance. In the second quote, it says, it is necessary to point out that those who defend a literal interpretation of Genesis are not defending such an interpretation, but rather a compilation of and selection from two different stories whose details are mutually exclusive and which cannot therefore be interpreted without falling into contradiction. And so here, in the video about science and Genesis, there were some further points that further expanded my thoughts on the idea of creation. The first is that the Bible is not a book, it's a library. And it's an ancient document that wasn't written to us, but for us. But it was written to a different context, a different culture, a different everything than what we understand. And we will always try to take our modern context and read it into the ancient text and try to make it fit with what we understand it to be. And that's just not the way to go about it, because we're always going to come up short with something. We're always going to not understand. It's always going to be something scientific that doesn't really make sense. So creation stories are also stories that existed at the time. And I've always wondered that there were stories that existed, and it sounds kind of similar to the Genesis story. And it says that it's not necessarily a genuinely new idea. It's actually very common to have creation stories back then. And so Genesis was actually written as a countermeasure against those other cultures. The cultures and their creation stories. And in light of those stories, it speaks the same theologically, but it turns it around and says that Yahweh is God. And so with other cultures, they had, many different creation stories where there were several gods, and that, there were battles, and that the earth was born out of chaos and things like that. But here we have a story that says that no, Yahweh is God, and he's the only one that created the earth. And that is a huge thing to say, because the culture was very polytheistic back then. So to say that no, only one God created this earth was a huge statement, and that was the purpose of Genesis. So I think in my prior understanding, like before I came to this course, I was always a very diehard Genesis as a literal interpretation. That the earth, was created in 6 days. Clearly, we need to take the Bible at face value. This is, what I believed. And I think things that contributed to that was just the environment I grew up in, the churches that I went to, kind of all took that stance. And so that's something that I never really tried to explore. And whenever someone would kind of say to me, like, oh, I believe in the Big Bang Theory, that God spoke it, and then, the Big Bang Theory came into be. And I'm like, no, that's not true. God created it in 6 days. That's what we need to focus on, and there's no need to entertain that other thing. And so this concept that it could have been an evolutionary process, or it could have been literal, or it was written as a social commentary to combat other historical myths, just was shocking to me. And I didn't realize that the story of Genesis was contradicting itself within the first 2 chapters. And that's something that really stood out to me. And so I think in these ideas, especially in my Old Testament class, one of the things that stood out to me in that class is that in the Old Testament, it's not about all the individual characters that we tend to focus on. Like in Sunday school, we always tend to focus on like Noah and the ark, and then we talk about Jonah, and we always focus on the individual most of the time. And while we can glean lessons from those individuals, the biggest thing that the Old Testament is pointing out is who God is and his character, and it is God-centric, not people-centric. And I think that we tend to forget that. So I think in learning this about the creation story, I've learned, like, wow, like, the point is not that the earth was created in 6 days. The point is not that that God said, let there be light first. Or the point of it is that Yahweh, our God, created the earth, period. And it doesn't, however that looked, however that was, we can't really understand that anyway. So it's no point in trying to argue that. The point is that God created the earth, point blank. And I think that that's something that will help me to continually not try to focus so much on the small details, but to look towards God in focusing on God and what I'm reading and what I'm taking in. And so this new understanding, I believe, will help me in my community, because I'll be able to not necessarily take everything and try to argue with people about, X, Y, and Z and why creation is this, whatever, but just really try to point others to know what really matters is God. And this is what Scripture is trying to tell us about Him.